Friday of finals week. Once I put my grades in, I put my grades in. So. Any other questions? Concerns? All right, so I'm going to start the lecture. What do we have? 26 people. Good enough. Tonight's going to be a long lecture. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry for me. Probably go 2 hours. Another one of these content-rich history lessons. We're going to be talking primarily about your primary reading, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. This is like probably one of the most published academic books in the history of the world. I think it's been translated in, I don't know, 20 something different languages. But I'm also going to be giving you history to fill in, what came before nationalism and why do scholars believe that, modern nation states and modern nationalist identities are qualitatively different from, medieval forms of political organization and identity. And so that's kind of what your Harman reading is. That Harman reading is kind of just to give you some historical context. So some of what I say may overlap with that or not, but I'm just trying to give you as much historical context as possible within a reasonable, amount of reading for you to be able to make sense of, what we mean by nationalism in a conceptual sense. So let's start off with kind of the basics of Anderson. First, the title, right? The title is Imagined Communities. Why does Anderson say that that nationalist identities are imagined? Anybody do the reading ahead of time? So the reason they're imagined is because we don't really have a material connection to even a small percentage of the people who share our identities, right? If you think about the different identities you have in your own life, right? Think about just the racial and ethnic or national identities that you have that you identify with or whatever. How many people in the world share that identity? Maybe if you're from a very small, group, tens or hundreds of thousands, but there's many that are in the millions or hundreds of millions or even billions, right? So how many people share this identity with you, and what do you really share with them, right? Other than the identity. How many of these people do you actually know in your real life? I mean, aside from people who share your identity, just think of how many people do you actually know in real life that you interact with on a face-to-face basis? Think in the last 6 months or year. Count the people. How many people have you really had any type of interaction where they know who you are and you know who they are, and there's some kind of substance there? Maybe a few dozen at most. Even on your Facebook, you might have hundreds or thousands of followers, but you probably don't know but a small percentage of them in real life, right? So how many people can we really possibly know personally, face to face? Those are the people. That's a community. A community is people who actually really know each other personally, and their lives are intertwined, right? But nationalist identities create a community out of thousands or millions of people, right? Who presumably have some intrinsic, something that they share, even though they really may or may not share any number of different, some of them may be rich, some of them may be poor, some of them, may be whatever, right? There's so many different variations among us, right? Why do these identities have meaning for us? Because we imagine that we have a connection to these people. Yeah, someone said it's like being a sports fan. That's a prescient comment. Sports is a form of nationalism. That's how we train our children. You know, how to think about how, as a child, how you were trained to be a nationalist. First of all, if you grew up in America, they made you say the Pledge of Allegiance every day, right? Pray to a piece of cloth. Then, you know, sports teams, we're encouraged, or we encourage our kids to be fans of some football team, or if you're American, baseball team or basketball team or whatever, right? And people take on this identity as if it's like intrinsic to their being, you know. And if they meet other people who are fans of the same team, they feel like they're friends. And if they see someone who's, you know, from the rival team, God forbid you wear some Dodgers gear in San Francisco Mission District, you're going to get run up on, right? Why? What do we don't even know each other? Like, bro, I don't even know you. Like, I may like the Dodgers, but other than that, we may not have anything in common, right? Same thing with other types of identities, right? So being a sports fan is actually it's an interesting one, because that's kind of like our training growing up, so that when we're adults, these nationalist, you know, ethno-racial national identities, it's natural for them to seem so important to us, because as a child, we grew up, you know, thinking of ourselves in this box or the other. So they're imagined. That's the point. There's not actually a substantive material connection between all of the people who presumably share any nationalist identity on whatever basis, you know, religion, race, ethnicity, national origin, whatever. Now, these imagined communities are not infinite, right? People don't imagine their national identity as encompassing the earth. It's not like Christianity, where Christians, you know, at least at one time, were trying to convert the whole world so the whole world would be Christian, right? But nationalist identities are different in that they're limited. They have hard boundaries, at least in our minds they do, right? And so there's, you know, first of all, think of how similar this is to the race concept, right? Everyone has a nationality. No one is nationless, right? You're either Mexican, or you're German, or you're Chinese, or you're, you know, Indonesian, or you're, you know, New Zealander, or whatever, right? Everybody is a citizen of somewhere, according to nationalism, right? But not everyone is a citizen of there, right? There are boundaries, conceptual boundaries, and of course, we're going to talk about, you know, boundaries, geographical boundaries between different nationalist identities. Next is that nationalist identities are sovereign. What does sovereignty mean? It means that you're free of outside domination, right? So now part of this is, as we're going to see, the original states, nation states that emerged in the modern, you know, nationalist model, emerged out of Creole, out of colonial administrative territories, right? And so they want to create a sovereign territory that's not under the authority of the king of their home country, right? So you know, think of the time period here, right? Hundreds of years ago, people, you know, in Europe and people in European colonies are breaking free from the authority of kings, right? So the monarchical system is, and even within Europe, is being transformed into a parliamentary system, right? So sovereignty, but also sovereignty from other states, right? People who have, you know, people who imagine that they have a nationalist identity and that they share this identity with other people, either imagine themselves as the citizens of some state that's intrinsic to their identity, or imagine a state that should exist, right, but that is now occupied by other people, right? Next is community. That nationalist identities imagine that people who share them have some intrinsic common interests that transcend any other material differences between them, right? That the wealthiest people and the poorest people, should support each other, or in other case, in other words, the poorest people shouldn't give the wealthy people any trouble because they all share the same identity. They're all one people, right? So it collapses the class structure into a single identity that transcends it and prevents challenges from the bottom to the top, right? It imagines a sense of community among people who, in a material sense, may have very different interests. Another aspect of nationalism is chauvinism. Chauvinism, right? And so that means that people imagine themselves as being members of different identity groups. And therefore, by creating boundaries around themselves, they put themselves in opposition to anyone who is not a member, does not, cannot make a bona fide claim to their identity group, right? So there's insiders and outsiders. We're going to talk in a little bit about how this works out in a nation state, right? But fundamentally, nationalism is a chauvinist ideology. It thinks that people that are different than you or me or whatever are, can't be trusted, are not insiders, are outsiders, are foreigners. So let's think about this all together, right? Is nationalism a uniting or a dividing ideology? Does nationalism encourage solidarity or division? Someone said both, right? Now it's clear that it's uniting for people who are members of any given identity group, right? But it's a fundamentally divisive ideology in that it separates everyone from everyone else. It puts us all in these different boxes of who we share interests with. And if we're in a box with people who share our interests, that means people outside of the box are a threat to our interests. So really nationalism is, on first glance, it seems like it's a good thing, right? And in English, we actually have two words that have different connotations, right? What's the other word we use for nationalism in English? Many languages don't have two words. Patriotism, right? When people say patriotism, that's something that's good. We should all get behind that, right? But what is patriotism? Is the nationalism of a specific identity group in opposition to other identity groups, right? That's what a war is people on patriots on different sides taking up arms to kill people that are in the other identity group. Who is it that's fighting the wars? Right? It's always the people at the bottom that are fighting the wars, who basically share the same material interests relative to the people at the top on both sides, right? Anderson cited another famous scholar of nationalism, Ernest Gellner, who said that nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness. It invents nations where they did not previously exist, right? So what does he mean by that? As we go through the history of different nations, as we're going to this lecture, you'll see that what we think of as identities that are important to us today, or to people in different countries around the world, right, are really a historical construction that in most cases is relatively recent, right? And the way that we think about different countries and different nations and different identities for ourselves and others is really a function of the modern age, right? Particularly taking off like in the late 18th century and particularly the 19th century and 20th century. So before we get into the history, let's look at Anderson's 5 components of nationalist states. And keep in mind the similarity here between these and the 5 components of the race concept, right? Which has already been formed at this point when nationalist ideology and nationalist states emerge. So number 1 is homogeneous populations, right? Homogeneous population, which means that the members of a nationalist state imagine that the bona fide citizens of this state all share the same identity. Mexicans are from Mexico, Germans are from Germany, Italians are from Italy, you know, Iranians are from Iran, whatever, right? That each country, each nation, each people, right, has an overwhelming identity that represents the nation, right? And the nation is comprised of who? Of these people. And so therefore, someone who comes into a nation, a state, from somewhere else in the world, no matter how long they're there, they will never really be seen as a true member of that society, right? A good example of this is in Europe, in Northern Europe, Western Europe. I think I mentioned this before, you know, the primary foreign, you know, non-native population is people from the Middle East. And so there's a whole lot of people living in Germany and Denmark and Sweden and, you know, France and all these different places who are not Danish and German and Swedish and French, right? Now them and especially their children grew up in these countries. They grew up speaking French and Danish and German, and those are their primary languages in the sense that they've spoken them from, you know, from birth virtually. They're probably bilingual or in many cases even trilingual, right? But they've had all the same experiences as native Danes or native Germans or, you know, native French. Yet they will never really be fully accepted as French and Danish and Swedish and German and so forth, right? They are the perpetual other within those societies because nationalist identity is predicated on this myth of homogeneity within populations, right? Any questions about that? Number 2, standardized language. So in the modern nationalist ideology, we believe that those who share a common identity also share a common language, right? That defines that identity and the members of that, the bona fide members of that group. People in Germany speak German or High German, actually. People in, you know, Denmark speak Danish. People in, you know, other countries have you know, in America, we speak American. No, we speak English, right? In Mexico, they speak Spanish. But these languages are presumed to be the language that everyone who lives in that country shares, right? That language, sharing that language and being able to communicate with one another, you know, whether you live in LA or you fly to New York or, you know, you live in, you know, Hamburg and you go visit Berlin, everybody can talk in the same language. Everybody, you know, in modern times, everybody watches TV in the same language, right? Listens to music in the same language and so forth. And that's what makes us a people, right? Is that we have a standard language that we all as a people share. Number 3 is a contiguous territory. A contiguous territory. Hey, you know what? I should be sharing my screen. What am I doing? There, you guys see that? A contiguous territory means that you can essentially draw a line around our people on a geographical map that encompasses all of the people who share this identity, right? It's not like some of us are over here and then some of us are 1,000 miles away over on this other continent. And then some of us are on some islands in the middle of nowhere. And then we have this other country, just like it's not quite attached to us. There's another country in between us, but then we're over there too, right? No, countries are, you can, for the most part, except for some, maybe some tiny islands somewhere in the middle of nowhere, you can draw a line around a country, right? And, on the map, and when you look at a map or when you see the outline of a country, especially if it's a country you identify with, you probably recognize that. Hey, that's Mexico, or that's, Russia, or that's, I don't know, China or whatever, right? America, if you see America, they print it on t-shirts, right? You guys have probably seen this. You got outline of America on my t-shirt, so I don't forget where I'm at. Contiguous territory. Number 4 is a myth of origin. Right? Modern nation states have to create a myth of origin for themselves, right? That either explains their invention or connects them to an ancient civilization, an ancient or medieval civilization with which they claim to be the modern iteration of. Now, why are these myths, right? Because the narratives that nations use, that nationalist identities employ to, make a claim to a common identity and to a historical, something in the past, doesn't necessarily have to be historically accurate, right? It can be not true, and it doesn't really matter as long as everyone kind of pretends that it's true. It still serves the same purpose. Number 5, cultural identity. People who share a nationalist identity, right? This is just like the race concept. Imagine that they share cultural practices and cultural praxis among themselves that's unique to them. There's a certain type of food they eat, right? There's a certain types of clothes that they wear, particularly maybe for holidays and things like that. Most of us don't wear our native garb regularly, but some people like to put on their native garb, for special holidays or things like that. Or for some identity groups, like for Pan-Africanists, they wear, what do you call the colorful shirts? I can't remember, from West Africa. Anyways, why do people do things like that, right? Why do people, like to eat at food that's from their own culture, their own country or whatever, right? Because that's part of our identity. We imagine that, Mexicans eat Mexican food, and African Americans eat soul food, and Americans eat hamburgers, and Italian people eat pasta, and whatever we think, right? All of these practices, right? All of these, language is part of that too. Religion is part of it, right? People from Italy should be Roman Catholics, right? People from Russia should be Eastern Orthodox, right? People from Saudi Arabia should be Sunni Muslim. People from Iran should be Shia Muslim, right? There's all of these different cultural practices that we assume and that we identify with as members of a nationalist identity. And that we assume that everyone else who shares that nationalist identity, they have to check those boxes, right? They have to, if they don't do those things, then they're not part of us. Any questions about any of that before I jump into the history part of the lecture? So that's our framing for today. All right, so let's start back in time. I believe I made this point before at the time, but remember back to our, I think, first or second lecture, we're talking about prehistoric civilizations, right? Before writing and before sedentary agriculture. Could there have been such a thing as nationalist identities at that time, right? No, it's not possible for people to have identities in the way we think of them, right? For a number of reasons. Basically, people weren't, able to communicate over large distances and were limited by how far they could or would walk, right? And not to mention, there weren't that many people on the planet back then, right? And so, how many people would someone even have met face to face over the course of their entire life? Maybe a few dozen, maybe into the low hundreds at the most, right? I mean, all of the Mesopotamia had 10,000 people or so, right? How many people do you actually know? And if you're just wandering around, and maybe you meet some people over here and you meet some people over there, and they might tell you, hey, if you keep going that way, another few months, you'll find some other people over there. But other than that, that's about the extent of your knowledge of how many people are out there as far as you're concerned, right? You may not even know that there's more than a couple of hundred people out there in existence, right? So do you really think of those other people as being different from you when you meet them every year at the pass or for the festival, and one of you joins their tribe and mates up, and one of them joins yours, and you exchange and so on and so forth, right? Do people really, if you're born in one valley, right, and then you're hiking and foraging and stuff, and your kid is born on a mountaintop 100 miles away, where are you from? Are you both from the same place? That's your child. Like, you're obviously have a connection, but are you from anywhere? Or are you from everywhere? Right? So the bases of our modern identities really aren't possible in a hunter-gatherer society, right? And could not really conceptually have existed prior to sedentary agriculture. It was sedentary agriculture that originally rooted us in a particular geographic location for us even to think of ourselves as, wow, hey, we're from this little valley where we grow this food, and we stay here because we can grow our food here, and hey, that works out. We've never been anywhere else, right? That's where even the possibility of thinking you're from somewhere, right? It's even possible. Now, in in ancient societies, right, like the ancient Egyptians or Romans or the ancient Qin Empire or whatever, right? Did they have nationalist identities in the sense that we think of? Now, you can kind of, if you think about it, draw a line around all of Rome, think of all the lands that Rome conquered and controlled, all of the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, the Middle East, what's now Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, all Turkey, Greece, of course, Italy, all through the Balkan region, halfway into Germany, really, right? And now, but within that territory, was everybody considered to be a Roman? No, right? The Romans thought of who were the Romans were really people from Rome, but not long into the empire, people from the Italian peninsula. People from other regions were Gauls or, thought of as Germans or Goths or, different people that they had been fighting with and or conquered, and so on and so forth, right? So the Roman identity wasn't something that pervaded the empire. In fact, in the Roman Empire, the Romans were in the minority, right? If it wasn't a homogeneous society, right? The people who ruled the society were actually numerically in the minority and really originally occupied a very small area of what became the Roman Empire, right? So you can see how this is very different from a modern nation state. Did people in Gaul all speak Latin? No, they spoke in their local languages, and only the Roman governor and maybe the leaders of the local people would have to learn Latin so they could go and talk to the Roman governor for their grievances and so forth. But the Roman identity didn't pervade the Roman Empire, right? That's the difference between an empire and a modern nation state, right? Even Egypt, which didn't conquer anywhere near as much territory as the Romans did, but the Egyptians went south down Nile and conquered Upper Egypt, the Kushite regions, and and back and forth. There's an Egyptian dynasty of pharaohs who were Kushites who had conquered the Lower Nile. So there's multiple different people. Imagine how many different cultural groups and different lingual communities and the Roman Empire contained, or the Qin Empire, or whatever. Like, this very different from a modern nation state where everybody in Italy speaks Italian, right? So and so forth. Now, what about medieval kingdoms? How do medieval kingdoms and forms of political organization differ from our modern nation states? So I'll give you some examples there too, and kind of the prototypical one I think is the Normans. Anybody know who the Normans are? It's that old diner, Norms. I keep closing them down. It's really depressing. I feel old every time one goes away. The Normans. Okay, so they don't have anything to do with Norms, unless maybe Norm was a Norman. I don't know. So the Normans are people who occupy a region of northwest France called Normandy. And they're historically descended from this historical figure who really was a real person, Rollo, who was a Viking, the leader of a Viking band. And these Vikings came into France and started sailing up the rivers and attacking people. And they managed to, raid all the way up to Paris, pretty much. And they were, such a pain for the French, for the King of France, that he decided to just offer them a whole region. So he said, hey, Rollo, if you can get these Vikings to chill out and you guys stop raiding and pillaging us, then I'll just give you this whole part of the country and you can have that. And what are the Vikings thinking? They're like, well, we can grow a lot better wine down here than we can up there. So sure, we're staying. So that became Normandy, right? Where you might have seen Rollo, or at least a partial fictional version, that docu-series, it's not really a docu-series, but that, drama, Vikings. Anybody see that? Vikings? It was like, I don't know, on Netflix or whatever these streaming platforms are. There's a character in there that's supposedly the brother of the lead character, that's not historically accurate, but one of the characters is named Rollo. And so that's kind of this guy who went to France and became French. And so his descendants ruled this area of France called Normandy and spoke, a dialect of French. They spoke Norman French, and they were very, maybe because they were descended from Vikings, I don't know, but they were very good fighters, and they ended up conquering places all over the known world at that time. The crown of England to this day are ostensibly the descendants of a Norman, William the Conqueror, who invaded England in 1066, right? That was a Norman. He was one of the descendants of Rollo, and he invaded England and became the king. And, think about, like, what does it even mean to be English? Today, we think of being English as speaking English, number one, right? Being from England, number two, right? Well, Rollo and all of the people that, ran the country for him weren't from England. They weren't even from France, right? They were from Denmark or Sweden or, Norway or some damn place, right? And they didn't speak English either. William the Conqueror, did not speak English. He ran the country speaking Norman French, right? Actually, when they first took over the country for the first 100 or 150 years, everything, all of the court's business was written in Latin. And then they switched to Norman French for another, I don't know, 100 years or so. It was like, I don't know, 200-300 years before there was even an English king who spoke English. Right? Kind of puts the whole, identity of being English in perspective. They didn't stop there. They went down another Norman. What happens in the Middle Ages is the eldest son inherits the father's lands, but the other sons, they got to go out and conquer something, or they can just get drunk and party all the time, or maybe they can go on crusade or whatever, right? So one of these sons of a Norman, king, nobleman, whatever, went down to Sicily and conquered Sicily. And they went up and conquered Calabria, the part of Italy that's at the tip of the boot. And they actually conquered all the way up the Italian peninsula, including Rome, and took the Pope hostage. And then they realized the error of their ways, and they did penance and begged the Pope for his forgiveness. Actually, they begged in front of the castle doors all winter and froze their asses off until finally the Pope said, okay, you can work for me now. And then they went and conquered the rest of Italy for the Pope. Very, very industrious people, these Normans, right? They also conquered part of North Africa, what had been Carthage in the Roman Empire, and what we now call Tunisia was also ruled by the Normans. They also took part in the Crusades and established a Crusader settler city, the city of Antioch in what's now Syria, right? So we have Normans like in France and in England, and then down in Sicily, and then up here in Italy, and then all the way down there in Tunisia, and then thousands of miles away over here in Syria, right? This is not the same as our modern nation states, right? Where is the contiguous territory? Imagine the number of people, the number of different cultural communities and linguistic communities they ruled over, right? In England, you have at court, they're speaking Norman French, but the common people are speaking Old English, or, the two actually morphed. What we call English is a mixture of Old English and Norman French. In Sicily, there's Latin people, Latin-speaking people, Greeks, Arabs, Berbers, right? Same thing in North Africa. In the Middle East, right? How many people? You have Arabs and Jews and Armenians, and right? Think of all the different, like, is there one identity of even being Norman, like at that time? A Norman is whoever gets on this ship and has some armor and a sword and is down to put in work, right? So the idea of a nation state and the way that we think of it, and the corresponding nationalist identity as we think of them, right, just didn't exist in the Middle Ages the way we think of it, right? Another from the late Middle Ages example is the Habsburg Empire. They said it was it encompassed so much of the world that it was the empire on which the sun never sets. And in the early 16th century, right, let's talk about the different regions that were controlled by the Habsburg Empire. First of all, who was the king? Charles V, the king of Austria, Hungary, Lower Germany, Northern Italy, islands throughout the Mediterranean, Spain, Portugal. And where did Spain and Portugal conquer? Brazil. Actually, Cortez and the Incan Empire were annihilated in the name of Charles V. The Philippines, which had previously been conquered by the Spaniards, right? Like, think of how many different disparate people there are all across the world that, think of just the number of linguistic communities in the Americas that this empire ruled over, right? There's not, even in Europe, they don't all speak in Spain, they speak France. In Spain, they speak Spanish. In Portugal, they were speaking Portuguese. In France, they're speaking French. And in Austria, they're speaking Low German dialect. And in there's not one identity, there's not one language, there's not one contiguous territory, right? There's not one myth of origin that connects all of these people, right? The only thing that connects them is that they've been conquered and they're under the political control of the king of the Habsburg Empire, right? So what is it? How do we start to develop this this sense of nationalist identity that we have today? You know what? Give me 1 sec. Let me grab a new drink. My water ran out. So a significant happenstance in European history was the introduction of the printing press in the 15th century. Now, it started off slow, but picked up real fast. By the way, Europeans didn't invent the printing press, the Chinese did. And we're not absolutely sure about whether it was, someone brought the idea from China, or maybe it was someone came up with the idea after the fact or whatever. But first off, let's think about, prior to the printing press, how were books produced in any language? And in Europe, what language were they being produced in? For the most part. If everybody in Europe is Roman Catholic, Western Europe, Northern Europe, and what's the language of the Roman Catholic Church? Latin, right? So, first of all, almost nobody was literate, right? Not even kings were literate in the Middle Ages. People who ruled over vast territories were themselves illiterate in many cases, right? So who was literate? Monks, right? People who had dedicated their lives to the church, and maybe some ministers, or in some cases, some wealthy people just out of curiosity, right? Government ministers would have had to be able to read and write in order to conduct government business, right? But what did they read and write in? For the most part, in Latin, right? So if a king in France needed to contact, a king in Spain, or, talk to the Pope in Italy, or whatever the case is, what language would that correspondence be in? In French or Spanish? No. Or Italian? No. In Latin, right? And so Latin persisted as a written language long after the Western Roman Empire fell. And so think about that in the Middle Ages. Almost no one is literate in the first place. And people who are literate in a language that almost no one speaks as an actual living language. There was one region that spoke Latin in the Middle Ages, and that's Byzantium, what's now Istanbul. And their lands were progressively shrunk over the course of the Middle Ages, and they were eventually conquered by the Turks. But other than Byzantine controlled areas, no one spoke Latin, in Western Europe as a living language, in order to communicate in business or commerce or at home or anything like that, right? Probably the clergy they would speak Latin during Mass, and, for formal, just like now, right? You can go to Catholic Church today and have Mass in Latin, right? But it wasn't the language that people were using as a common vernacular, right? Anywhere. But if you had to learn how to read and write, you had to learn to read and write in this language, and nobody spoke, right? It's not very conducive to, a wide number of people being literate, and, therefore a wide readership of books that happen to be written. And who wrote these books? Who wrote, first of all, what's the book that was most commonly wrote? Were copies of the Bible. And how were these books made? Some monk would dedicate his life to the church and sit in a, church somewhere and just all day and night copy down page by page in the most, elaborate handwriting he possibly could. Because, hey, if you're going to spend all this time copying these books, your whole life, you might as well make it look good, right? You guys ever seen any pictures of these, pages of manuscripts from the Middle Ages? They have all these fancy borders and gold leaf and stuff like that, all this decoration. Why is that? Because if you're going to spend the time to copy a whole giant book by hand, right, you might as well spend the time to make it look kind of nice. Think of the other thing. Books are very expensive items. In order for you to have a book, you have to have paid for the room and board of the person who sat there writing, copying, doing the art, all that. For how long does it take to copy the entire Bible? Right? Years, probably. So you have to be pretty wealthy to, each book that's in existence represents, many months or multiple years of someone's life that was spent copying to create that book, right? Books are very rare and very, very valuable, invaluable, to some extent. Even in the Arab world at the time, right? In the Middle East or in North or West Africa, or East, West, or North Africa, right? All of the books are written in Arabic, in Quranic Arabic, right? They're not written in the local dialects and the local vernaculars that people use in their everyday lives, right? And so only people who are educated can read and write in these old languages that books are written in, for the most part, right? How does the printing press change that, right? Well, print capitalism is, the printing press came in, look at the overlap at the same time that agrarian capitalism was starting, right? Agrarian capitalism was really taking off in the 16th century, and same thing with book printing. Prior to the 16th century, there were 20 million copies, 20 million books in existence. In the 16th century, 200 million books were printed. Think of the order of magnitude that, that this massive, suddenly there's all these books being printed. And why are they printing these books? Because they want to sell them, right? They're trying to make money. And so if you're a printing house, how many books can you print in Latin? And how many people out there can actually read these books? Next to nobody, right? And so it starts to make sense to start printing books using the Latin alphabet, right? And this is why we all use the Latin, all of these European language at least, use the Latin alphabet, because Latin had been previously the common tongue, the lingua franca of written language. And so they just used that alphabet to write in the local dialects of where the printing houses were located, which was where did the first printing houses get built, and the first printing industries? In major cities in each country. And so wherever the first printing houses started, right, the local dialect there is the dialect that was being printed and put on pages. And so people who were getting these books all over the country, who may have spoken different dialects and different vernaculars, had to learn to read in that what became a standardized language vernacular, right? The one that's on the printed page. So English, the English that we speak today, where did the first printing presses in England pop up? In London. So the proper English that's spoken today is really Londinian English. The standard English that we read in is Londinian English, because that was the first language in Britain that was being printed in books. And so everybody had to learn that, right? Prior to that, people are speaking very different languages from different language families in different parts of the country, right? Um, another good example, Spanish, right? What's the standard Spanish in Spain, particularly? The standard Spanish is Castilian Spanish, right? Which is the language of the Kingdom of Castile. Where was the first printing presses built in Spain? Right? In Madrid, in the Kingdom of Castile, right? And so because the rulers of Spain were Castilian and the printing presses were, first put together in where their seat of power was, right? It's their dialect that became the standardized dialect. Are there different dialects and maybe even call them different languages in different parts of Spain? Anybody ever been to Spain? Of course, right? In Galicia, they speak Galician. In Barcelona, they speak Catalan. In Valencia, people who grew up in Valencia, they speak Valencian, which is very similar to Catalan. Right? And even think about Spanish in the Americas, right? There's a particular in Mexico, where people from Mexico, or Chicanos here in the American Southwest, speak Spanish completely different from how people in Spain speak Spanish. There's a Mexican Spanish vernacular, right? Which is different from, I don't know if you guys like to watch Spanish language TV, different from the Spanish, think of the television shows and the series that are produced in Colombia, right? It's a different Spanish. And then there's the standard, the Latin American standardized Spanish that they use in commercials and, movies where it's not clear where it's taking place and stuff like that, right? But even though there's all these different dialects that people speak, in written Spanish, there's a standardized version. This is what we, learn in grade school. In grade school, we take these, writing and English classes, and they teach us grammar. What is grammar? Grammar is them telling us that there's a right way and a wrong way to construct words and sentences and paragraphs, right? Linguistically, is there a right or wrong way? No. What makes a language standardized? What makes it standardized is that it's printed on the page, right? Once you print a language on a page, it stops morphing, right? It stops developing the way a language normally would, right? So even though our vernaculars evolve, like, there's slang that we used when I was a kid that kids don't use anymore, or that people use in one region of the country and they don't use in another. I grew up here in LA, so I grew up saying fool. What's up, fool? What's cracking, fool? How you doing? Yeah. In New York, they don't say fool. So when I moved to New York to go to grad school, I'm calling all my friends, what's up, fool? How you doing, fool? They're like, God damn it, stop saying that. But then by the time I left, some of them were saying, what's up, fool? What the fuck am I saying? I'm not from LA, right? We have these different vernaculars, but when we write something, like whether someone writes a book in LA or New York, it's written in the same standardized, right? The same standardized English. So it erases these geographic, differences between us. We may be very far apart in different parts of a country, but the standardized language, right, it's only possible because of the printing press, makes us feel like we have that connection to one another. I think I talked about pretty much all of that. And so what is it about print language that's so important for nationalist identity? Number one is that it creates a unified field of exchange and communication. A unified field of exchange and communication. That no matter where you're from in the country, right, you can communicate with other people verbally or in writing, right? If you have business with someone in a different city, if you go and travel somewhere else, right? If you need to write a letter to someone, to communicate with someone in writing, right? You all have this it's like a closed market of everyone who shares that same standardized language. Number two, the fixity of print language suggests a timeless continuity. So remember how I talked about that once you put something on a page, it stops its development, right? The language becomes kind of frozen in time, right? That the fact that the language is frozen in time like that, and we can, today we can read something that was written 50 or 100 or even 200 years ago and make perfect sense of it, right? Maybe 200 years ago because of the prose, they made it difficult for us. But it's the same print language, right? It's the same standardized language that we're reading. But, that's not in fact, languages change over time. So it gives us this impression that those of us who share this one same language that we always have, that our parents shared the same language and their parents shared the same language all the way back to the dawn of time, which is historically, factually not true, right? We've only shared the same language since the invention of the printing press, right? And even the idea that we still do is somewhat of a myth, because in actuality, our vernaculars, are so different that, even within the same country in different places, you can't, understand what people are saying. If you speak Spanish and you ever go to Spain, I highly suggest you go to Barcelona. It's beautiful. The food is amazing. The beaches are great. But try to talk to someone who's speaking in the local Catalan. Spanish is not going to, Italian probably prepare you better for that than Spanish would, right? But you're in Spain. Now, everybody in Catalonia has to learn Castilian Spanish in school, but they also teach Catalan, which is, similar to Spanish, kind of somewhere between Spanish and Sicilian. I don't know, in my view, not being a linguist. But in any case, number two, the fixity of print language creates this artificial sense that we, the people who speak this language, go back, way back into history to our ancestors and whatever. Number three is the advantage of vernacular proximity. That if we didn't have this unified field of exchange, right, we would all be speaking different vernaculars all over the place, and it would be really difficult for us to be able to communicate with one another, right? So it creates this proximity among us where we feel like those people are just like us, even though they may live in a totally different region and have totally, like in America, I don't know if anybody's ever driven across America. Can be dangerous, but just in certain states, don't get off the freeway, unless you can see the freeway, wherever you eat, get gas. Anyways, but drive, fly, wherever, go to parts of America, you can go to a steakhouse and eat a good American steak, right? And everybody else there is enjoying their steak, and they might talk a little different from you, but you're all Americans, right? You feel like you have a proximity to these people, even though you've never been in this fucking city before, right? You don't know any of these people at all. But you start some small talk at dinner and you start talking, you know what, those people are right. They're just like us. Like, you've never even been here before, bro. Like, this is your first day in this place. But it gives us the idea that we have a proximity to other people because of that convenience of being able to communicate with people, even across great distances, within the same nationalist nation state. Make sense? So what are the first nation states kind of in the nationalist model? And as with everything in this class, there are a lot of different opinions among scholars about where nationalism starts. Like there's some people that think the first English king who actually spoke English, Edward Longshanks, that's the beginning of England. They have an argument for why they think that, but I disagree. So I'm presenting you my perspective and the perspective of other scholars that are, that I agree with, that are more knowledgeable than me. And we see nationalism as originating in Creole states, colonial states. Creole, you probably think of Creole as like food from Louisiana or something. Creole actually means people who are from like somewhere in Europe and have settled, created a settler colony in some other part of the world, and their kids grow up there, so they may be Spanish or English. They themselves came from Spain or England, but their kids actually grew up in America or Venezuela or Colombia or whatever, right? And so their kids are Creoles. They're, they're descended directly from Spaniards and English and whatever, right? But they actually maybe have never even been to England or Spain. They've grown up, they've lived their whole lives in the colony, right? Those are Creoles. And so Creoles were basically the colonizers, the settlers for different European superpowers within the colonial territories that they controlled. And these territories were not countries, right, in the sense that we think of them. They were administrative territories for the home country. So, Spain had colonies all over, the Americas and the East Indies and Philippines and all that, right? And Portugal, Brazil and East Africa, West Africa and East Africa, and, the Indies and Indonesia and all this stuff, right? The Dutch, so on and so forth. But all of these different colonial administrative territories answered back to the home country, to the crown, to the king, wherever that was. And so America was really the first one of these to break off from the home country, right, and earn its independence in 1776, as we all learn as kids, right? And so America doesn't have a myth of origin that's rooted in something that happened before it. These Creoles, they're not from America. They're not Native Americans. They're settlers, right? And so they have to come up with a myth for the origin of this country. And what's the myth of origin in our country? Liberty and justice for all, right? Which is a big fat fucking lie. We all know that, right? This country was established as a slave state, right? Where people from Africa didn't even count as a whole person. They were, considered 3/5 of a person. It's in the Constitution. And 3/5 of a person for representation that certainly didn't represent their interests. So, this whole business about liberty and justice and the Constitution and all that, right? This is all nonsense. This country was established as a slave state. There's no denying that, right? It doesn't matter if it's actually factually true. It's the myth, right, that's important. Other Creole states, another early revolution was the French Revolution, but it quickly reverted back to a monarchist system. So I don't really put that in the same nationalist category. The Haitian Revolution, but I think probably the better example is the Bolivarian Revolution, right? The revolution that separated Spain's colonies in South America primarily from the crown, right? And the leader of that was Simón Bolívar. After the Bolivarian Revolution, they tried to establish one big country in South America called Gran Colombia, but it was a disaster, and it broke up into a bunch of different countries, the countries that we know today, most of them, right? Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela, so on and so forth. Did they abolish slavery? Simón Bolivar's call was libertad, right? Libertad for who? Right? They didn't. They kept slavery going even after the revolution, right? So but who was it that was leading the revolution? Who was Simón Bolivar? He was one of these Creole elite. He was a slave owner, right? He owned a plantation, and he was, of at least partial Spanish origin, right? And so, there's these states, these new states, are being established and creating their own myths of origin as they cut themselves off from the old world kingdoms. In the 19th century, we see the emergence of modern nation states, and the two that I'm going to give you use as examples here are Italy and Germany. Right now, we think of Italy as being one country, right? One unified political and cultural and linguistic entity, right? But has that always been the case? No, for most of its history, it's not even been unified politically, right? Prior to the invention of Italy in 1861, when was the last time before that the Italian peninsula was unified under one single political authority? The Roman Empire. That's how long it had been since, right? Like 1500 years. So what created the modern country of Italy that we imagine? Well, part of it is this sense among Italians that they share something in common. And what do they share in common? The printed language, right? Which is printed in what? Anybody speak Italian? It's Tuscan Italian from Tuscany, which is in the north of Italy, right? Actually, if you go to other parts of Italy, Calabria, especially Sicily, I've been to Sicily, it's gorgeous to go to the south of Italy. The Italian they speak there is not Italian, it's Sicilian, and it's very different from the Tuscan Italian. Maybe it's even closer to Catalan than it is to Tuscan Italian, right? But everybody in Italy reads books in Tuscan Italian. When you watch TV in Italy, people on TV are talking Tuscan Italian, unless the show is about people in some specific region, right? When you listen to the radio, right? All of these kind of artifices of, communication, these institutions that we use, all tell people in Italy, no, they didn't have TVs in the 19th century, right? But the printed word is what makes that, gives people in the Italian peninsula a sense that they all share this identity. And so there's this movement from the early 19th century, the early 1800s, to convince people that they are Italian, a nationalist movement to convince people that all of Italy should be unified into one country, all Italians together under one banner, right? And there were books, there were poets, propaganda, a whole decades and decades of campaigns of people pushing to unify, to convince people to unify Italy politically, right? Because of the conception that Italy was somehow, Italians had something in common intrinsically, right? Probably the figure that you may have heard the name of, that's the most widely recognized from the Italian nationalist movement is Giuseppe Mazzini. And one of the great heroes of the wars of Italian unification, Giuseppe Garibaldi, was a military man, a general, I guess, if you will. Ironically, Garibaldi was from the city of Nice. Anybody know where Nice is? Nice is in France today, right? In order for Napoleon III to support the unification of Italy and not himself invade and take it for himself, right? The deal they cut was to give him Nice. So it's kind of ironic. Garibaldi was one of these great military leaders of the Italian unification, wars of Italian unification, and his city got pawned off to the French so that Napoleon III would support the new country of Italy, right? So you can see how arbitrary it is. What is Italy and what is France? In Nice, what do they speak today? French. What do kids in Nice, what are they taught in school? French, right? Parisian French. Now, of course, the nationalism, if you take it to its logical conclusion, ends up being fascism. And that's why someone like Mussolini was able to gain control of the country by appealing to people's identity, right? What we call today identity politics, appealing to the identity of people in Italy, that they should be proud of Italy and make Italy, you know, a great state once again. And what's the myth of origin here, right? Who did Mussolini and Italian nationalists and many Italians today, who do they say that they are like the descendants of, the modern, you know, who are their ancestors? Is the ancient Romans, right? 1500, you know, now 2000 years ago. And they're saying that these are the same people. There've been a lot of people come in and out of Italy since then, right? How is anybody to know that is there anybody in Italy that can trace their own genealogy back to like some actual real life historical Roman? No way, right? Does it matter for Italians? No, right? It's not the history, it's the mythology of their origin. Germany is another good example. Prior to the invention of Germany, what we call Germany was a hodgepodge of all different kingdoms and principalities and dukedoms and ecclesiastical authorities and, you know, counties and city states and so forth, right? My mother's family, on her father's side, my grandfather's family, were German, but they really weren't German, because when they came here in like the 1840s, there was no such thing as Germany. They were citizens of Prussia, right? Which became the state that Germany was unified under after, you know, a whole century, the 19th century, of same thing, of all this propaganda, people writing books and articles and pamphlets. And there's actually a remnant of this nationalist movement that you're probably still familiar with today. Oktoberfest. What's Oktoberfest? It's just a big party in October, right? We probably think it must have something to do with Halloween, right? No. Oktoberfest, well, actually, it was started because there was this wedding and they wouldn't let them have beer at the wedding. And that's a good way to really piss Germans off, is to not let them have beer. So they decided to have this big party called Oktoberfest, where you know, make up for the beer they didn't get to drink at this wedding. And nationalists used Oktoberfest to have these festivals in different parts of Germany, so that people would all come together and they'd all drink beer together and they'd all sing German songs together and they'd all wear German clothes. And, you know, it manufactured an identity where one didn't previously exist, right? And Prussia was able to take advantage of this nationalist movement and unify the country under one king, the Kaiser Wilhelm, because they happened to, I shouldn't say lucky, they were a very strong military, but they managed to defeat the three regional powers, Denmark, France, and Austria, in small wars that they fought with each of them. And that basically gave them the right to take over all of Germany. But did they have to convince the Germans to form Germany? No, people were happy. We're all Germans anyways, right? And they're all, you know, in different parts of Germany, people speak different dialects even today, but they could all read and write and, you know, converse in the national language of German, which is really a dialect of High German, specifically the dialect from Berlin, right? Berliner. So the standardized German, same as everywhere else, right, is the result of this print capitalism that distributed books through the whole country in a standardized language, giving people the sense that they actually had this connection, that we're all Germans, right? And anybody who knows the history of World War II knows where this story ended up, right? If you take this nationalist chauvinism to its logical conclusion, what do you get? You get the Holocaust, right? This is the ideology of Hitler, right? And they would, you know, if you see this really in the iconography of the period. What were the Germans' myths of origin, right? One of them was they imagined that they were the descendants of the Vikings, right? And so they would use Nordic runes, like the Hitler Youth. The symbol for the Hitler Youth was a Tyr rune, Tyr, which is a diamond with two little legs off the bottom. If you ever see that tattooed on somebody these days, that's a Nazi, right? Unless like you're in Norway or something. And even then, probably still a Nazi, right? Because Nazis recognize shit like that. Like they're into the occult and the Viking culture and all that. So they recognize the runes and it means something to them. It's not as identifiable to the rest of us as like someone having a swastika on their neck. But Nazis these days are kind of clever. They don't put swastikas on their neck anymore, right? They do these little subtle things. Another one, the other myth of origin for the Nazis was the Teutonic Knights, this order of knights in the Middle Ages, right? Who they believed that they were descended from. And if you look, you can Google this stuff. The rallies that the Nazis would have, these big rallies Hitler would have, where he'd give these speeches where he was pounding on the table and all that, right? And there's tens of hundreds of thousands of people lined up and everything, and they'd have this big parade where they'd have tanks and Hitler would come in a car and wave to everybody. And look at the videos. They, in addition to all that, they'd have actually actors dressed up as medieval knights in armor and swords and the whole 9 yards, on horses, marching down the street with the tanks. Right? What is that? That's them trying to form a connection among Germans so that they think, hey, we're all descended from the Teutonic Knights. We're all the same people, right? We're going to win. We'll take on the whole world, right? We're the Vikings, right? That's nationalism, right? That's very different from what occurred prior to the modern period, right? These countries that we think of as being, solid entities with coherent identities attached to them are really rather recent inventions in most cases, right? And even older countries, right, that have longer histories, still in the pre-modern periods did not have these standardized, languages, standardized identities, universality of communication, all of contiguous territory, myths of all of these facets of the modern state, right? You just don't find. The closest actually you find to a common print language is, of course, in China, where printing was invented. And but for anyone who happens to be Chinese and speak Mandarin or Cantonese or some other language or dialect, right? They all use the same letters, right? The pictograms are the same no matter which language you're speaking, right? So the pictograms are the same, but the languages people are speaking may not be, right? Okay, so let's move on to our conclusion. Do you guys want to take a break, or should I keep going? Any opinions? Keep going? Right, unless anybody else, everybody says keep going. All right, I think I can hack it, so let's keep going. So we're going to talk a little bit about the last chapter I had you read for Anderson, the institutions of nationalism. And he talks about three: the census, the map, and the museum. And to that, I'm going to add a couple myself. We've talked a lot about language, but I'll talk a little bit more about it, but also the ubiquitous use of surnames, last names, or, in some parts of the world, first names, and the flag. So let's go through these one by one, some from Anderson, some from me. The census, right? Why is the census so important to nationalist identities, right? the census serves a function, right? Now it serves a couple of functions. Now it serves an obvious function of bureaucracy, right? Why does the state, why do modern states use a census? So that they can figure out who everyone is and where everyone is and what their condition is. And, it makes it easier to implement policy for the government if they have all of this data of who all is living within the country, right? But the census also has another function, in a conceptual function, and that it identifies who are the bona fide citizens, the real members of the country, of the nation, of the society, and who are the foreigners, right? Just like I talked about, people from the Middle East who live in Europe, in different countries, can have grown up there their whole lives, but still be considered foreigners, right? And so every country that does a census, right, almost everyone has a race or a national origin or an ethnicity, or that, and a language question as well. What languages do you speak? So on and so forth. What's the purpose of that is to identify people who are bona fide citizens of the country and people who are foreigners within their midst. Let me share the screen again. So it serves a function for bureaucracy and social control for the state's policies, but it also serves a divisive function in dividing us conceptually as natives and foreigners. Surnames are a good example of this, right? We assume a lot about people based on their surnames, right? People from different countries are assumed to have a certain range of acceptable surnames that are recognized as being native to that country and indigenous to that people, right? Even if it's not, like in Mexico, people are assumed to have Spanish surnames, just as they are in Spain. In England, people are assumed to have English surnames, and Germans, and Koreans, Korean family names, and so on and so forth, right? So there's certain names that, we identify with different people around the world. And so when we see someone's name, we make an assumption on who they are and where they're from and what their identity is, and whether we share an identity with them or whether they're different from us based on their name, right? Now, how many of you, let me stop sharing for a second so I can talk to you. How many of you know the origin of your surname? How many of you know when someone in your family line decided, okay, this is the name we're going to pick for our family? Does anybody even know the first person who had your surname, is anybody aware of anyone in their family line who didn't have a surname? Can anyone think back, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, or have they seen a family tree, great-great-great-grandparents that didn't even have a surname? Right. Well, actually, I'm probably one of the few people on planet Earth that can do that. Not by the name you know me by. This is actually not my birth name. My mother changed my name when I was, I don't know, 8 or 10 years old to shield me from racist Americans. My real name, well, my birth name is Robert Farshid Pajuhesh, and my Iranian name is Bobak Farshid Pajuhesh Sanjabi. You can see why my mom changed my name to protect me living in this country, right? And my father's surname, I know the origin of, because it was very recently that people in Iran were forced to take surnames. My full name, Bobak Farshid Pajuhesh Sanjabi. Sanjabi is our tribal affiliation. We're ethnic Kurds, and we're actually the southernmost Kurdish tribe, the Sanjabi. I know who in my family was the first to settle down from a nomadic way of life. It was my great grandfather. He left the tribe and settled in Kermanshah, which is a region in the Kurdish part of Iran, and opened a store, like like what we would call a liquor store, right? A market. And he didn't have a surname. He only had one name, right? And think about it. If you're out there herding goats all day, or you live in a small village somewhere in the middle of nowhere, how many fucking people are there going to be who are named Bob or Abbas, right? Or Jose or whatever, right? There's Abbas that lives on the hill, and there's Abbas that lives down by the river, right? Everybody knows which one you're talking about. Nobody likes the one that lives on the hill. Everybody likes the one that's down at the river. So if you're saying good things about Abbas, they know which Abbas it is, right? It's the one down by the river. Right? If you're like, fuck that Abbas, that mother, you don't need to tell me which one. I know which one you're talking about. I don't like him either. Right? If you live in a real community, not an imagined community, in a real community, you know who everyone is by name, by one name. You only need one name to know who they are, right? Why do you even need last names in the first place, right? Because the state imposes upon us that we had our great-grandparents or great-great or somewhere back in our line, whether we know it or not, got either chose or got assigned a name by the state, right? And why does the state need us to have names? First of all, same reason as the census, right? For the bureaucratic control. They have to know who we all are and where to find us. And if we all have just one name, well, then there's going to be too fucking many of us with the same name, right? They got to narrow it down. So an easy way to do that is, well, at least give people two names, their own personal name and then a surname, their family name, right? And then, of course, in our society, we have middle names, and some people have hyphenated last names, and we all have a social security number, right? And a driver's license number and all that, right? All of this serves the same purpose, right? It provides for the sorting that the state needs to engage in to be able to control us and tax us and, so on and so forth, right? Surnames also serve another purpose in differentiating who is and isn't a member of the state, right? Just like the census. So when my grandfather is the one that chose their surname, he couldn't choose Sanjabi as his surname. Why not? Because there's like 50 fucking thousand people who make up our tribe. Maybe even at that time, right? There's probably millions now. Not everybody can name Sanjabi. That's not going to, they can come around to collect taxes. Sanjabi, have you paid your taxes? Oh, yeah, I already paid them. Sanjabi, have you paid your taxes? Yeah, oh, I already paid them too. Yeah. Which Sanjabi are you talking about? God damn it. Right? So only the leading families of the tribe were allowed to use Sanjabi as their name. There are some people from Iran who have the name Sanjabi. There's a famous politician from Iran during the Shah's period, who his last name is Sanjabi. These are people who were descended from the leading tribes. Us peasants, us goat herders, had to choose names of our own. So my grandfather chose this name Pajuhesh out of a poem from the 19th century. And the poetry is very important in Iranian culture. So he chose this name. It's not a Kurdish name. We're Kurdish, but we don't have Kurdish names, right? So what's the identity that my grandfather was consciously taking on in choosing this name? Is an Iranian identity as opposed to a Kurdish one, right? My father and my grandfather are Iranian nationalists. And they believe that everybody in Iran should have common names in Farsi, because Farsi is a national language in Iran, right? See the logic here? So even though we're ethnic Kurds, even my father doesn't have a Kurdish name. Both his first and last name are Persian names, are Farsi names, right? So you can see how arbitrary it is that we have last names, and what purpose do they serve in us identifying ourselves and in other people identifying us as being members, authentic members of the group, or as being outsiders, right? Like when you probably saw my name on the syllabus or on the, department thing, you probably thought I had like blonde hair and blue eyes or something. Robert Donald Vida, like, am I at a fucking Trump rally or some shit? You didn't expect to see my big nosed ass over here. We assume a lot what people, because of people's names, right? If you think about it, there's actually this really interesting research in political science where they have people, indicate who they would vote for, right? And they create candidates that are virtually identical. And the difference is that, certain candidates have an Arabic name. And Americans always give the Arabic candidate less votes. Like Americans just, even if they have the same credentials, the same policy positions, everything, like having an Arabic name is a killer in American politics, right? And you probably, if you're old enough to remember when Obama was running for president, what's Obama's middle name? Hussein. Did they use that name on the campaign trail? Fuck no, right? They buried that shit deep. Barack Obama. Well, that sounds African, right? Actually, Barak is also an Arabic word, baraka. It means, ironically enough, it means that you're like, have God's favor. You're like the chosen one for God. So anyways, many African Americans take on this name. There's a lot of African Americans who have the last name Baraka. And so Barak is a variation on that. But Americans don't know shit like that. But they do know Hussein, right? Names, are one of the things we use to identify who's like us and who's not, right? Next up, the map, right? So the way we think of a map isn't the way maps have always been drawn. Like we think of a map as this, thing that represents where all the geographical bodies and bodies of water and so forth, and you can measure distance and so on and so forth. That's a very recent invention, right? For most of human history, people, kind of knew where they were going, but really didn't know where the hell they'd end up. Right? They just knew that certain time of year, you got to jump on this current and take this current across the ocean in this direction or whatever, right? They knew that if I want to visit this city, I got to get a horse and it's going to take me 2.5 months of riding this horse to get to that city, right? They didn't have a map showing that, to get from Paris to Rome was this many kilometers and that, you would, it would take, this and that. The maps of the time were just, here's one dot and there's another dot, and they would write on there, 6 months journey, 1 month journey, 2 months at this time of year, stuff like that. You should leave in the spring and, make sure you get back by the fall, stuff like that, right? So think about like what is having the cartography map, the geographical maps that we're familiar with, what does that do to your sense of yourself and others, right? You can actually have this visual representation of who you are. Oh, I'm right there in this line, right? And everybody else is there in other lines. And they colored them differently so we can tell that we're different, right? It's just like the printed word. It gives us this sense that, well, everybody who's within that line on this piece of paper, we all must have something intrinsically in common, right? Because we're all, let me share the screen, right? we're all from the same country. We're all the same people, right? To the point that those, I think, like I mentioned, the map, right, the drawing of the country itself becomes a symbol of us, right? People all over the world wear t-shirts and get tattoos, and you put stickers, and even think of many of the flags of the world we'll talk about in a sec. What's a common motif for flags is an outline of the map of the country that it represents, right? So maps aren't just a tool that we use to traverse the earth, right? They have a conceptual and a symbolic meaning, right? That gives our nationalist identities meaning in our minds, right? It makes us feel like that it's real, right? And, go down to the border between America and Mexico, and you will see that there is an actual, in much of it, some kind of physical barrier that reinforces this idea, not to mention the legal barriers, that there is a difference between us, even though we're living in the same place, basically, right? The flag, right? We think of flags as representing our identity as Americans or Mexicans or Chinese or Pakistanis or whatever, right? But that isn't actually the original meaning and use of a flag, right? Where did flags come from, and what did they mean, and what did they represent? Flags come from battlefields, right? In the Middle Ages and antiquity, they didn't have radios to, contact each other on the battlefield, and for commanders to give commands, and, so on and so forth, right? So what would they do? They would meet on some big open area where there was enough room to fight a huge battle. And ideally, the leaders would go up on a hill or somewhere a little bit higher so they could see over the battlefield. And all of the different units would have a flag, right? A banner that would be able to identify them on the battlefield. So the leader could sit up there on the hill, and he may not be able to see, everybody fighting and exactly what's going on, but he sees where the different flags are on the field, and he can, think, oh, okay, these people should retreat and they should attack, and those other people over there, they should flank to the right and whatever. And so how would they give their orders? Up on the hill, they would have a bunch of flag bearers with those same flags for each unit. And if they told them, they swing it forward, then charge. If they swing it in a circle, then retreat. If they, swing it to the side, then, flank, or whatever the case may be, right? That's what flags were used for in the ancient and medieval world. There was no flag of the Roman Empire, right? There was no flag for ancient Egypt. There was no flag for, the Qin Empire, right? This is a modern invention, a symbolic representation of the nation and of the identity too. Think about the identity groups of stateless populations, right? People who believe that they have an identity, but there's no country that coincides with it. My own people, the Kurds, imagine that they have a country that should be part of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and so forth, right? Now, I'm not a nationalist myself, so I don't believe that, but Kurdish people think that all of these different regions, because the majority of the population is, or in some cases isn't, Kurdish, that they should all be joined into one Kurdish state, right? Even though there has never been such a thing. There's never been a Kurdish state. It doesn't exist, right? It never has. It probably never will, right? Another one you may be familiar with locally among Chicanos is the Aslan, right? People believe that the Southwest of America, Chicano areas where Chicanos are in the majority, should be combined with Mexico and the rest of Mesoamerica into one grand raza state called Aslan, right? And there's actually a flag for this that has what? Anybody ever seen it? Has a eagle, the outline of an eagle, and it has a map of this state that people wish would come into existence, but has never existed. Actually, if you look through the historical record, no, that geographical area has never been unified under one political authority. right? Even in pre-Columbian times. Another one, you'll see the flag in our department right outside my office. The Pan-African flag, the Garveyite flag, it was invented by Marcus Garvey 100 years ago, looks just like the European flags, but it's different colors, right? It's 3 bars, just like, Italy or France or, a lot of Netherlands, lots of countries in Europe have the same exact design. So they just basically took the design of the European flags and instead of those colors had black, red, and green, right? Garvey, by the way, never stepped foot in Africa. But many people think of this as the symbol of a Pan-African state where the whole of Africa would be united into one identity, one political entity, right? Now, Garvey hoped that he would become the dictator of this, but that didn't work out. But has Africa ever been united under a single political authority? It never has, right? Does it matter to Pan-Africanists? No, right? They don't care. This is what they imagine, that there should be a state because they imagine that there's this community of Africans, that everybody from the continent of Africa shares some intrinsic interest and that they should all be in one identity category, right? That is nationalism. Next up, the museum. The museum, or as he infers, the academy, right? If you're going to establish a nationalist state, you need to convince the people that you're going to rule over that they all share the same identity, right? And that they all have the same origin, right? And that it's not an accident that they all speak the same language, right? Or if they don't, then you need to educate them all so they do speak the same language. And how does that occur, right? What are the institutions that are used to accomplish this? Well, if you want to prove that we're all from the same place and we all share the same origin, you need archaeology to dig things up out of the ground, right? Think about, in the ancient world, were they obsessed with digging up things out of the ground from the distant past? No, right? This is a modern preoccupation of people going, usually from Western countries, but now other countries are getting into it too, to dig stuff up out of the ground, to find some artifact, some historical relic of some civilization that existed, however long in the past. And why do they do that? Why the preoccupation with this digging up ancient artifacts? Because what's the propaganda use of these artifacts? They use these artifacts to tell us, look, these are our ancestors. They were doing this and that, and they were great civilizations and so forth. And if we follow in their footsteps, then we'll be a great civilization too, right? It's a vehicle for nationalist propaganda. And what's the biggest disseminator of nationalist propaganda today, as in the 19th century, is the university, right? Where did the idea that Germans should all be unified into one country, where did that idea come from? It came from German universities, right? The idea of other people to unify into one, Zionism also came from German universities, right? Of Jewish people where did Jewish people get the idea that they should all go back and take over Israel because 2,000 years ago, the Romans exiled them from where they had been at that time, right? This is a nationalist ideology that was learned in European universities, right? So the museum and the university are really institutions for indoctrinating the population with nationalist identities, right? Providing the supposed evidence and purported historical justification for the idea that there is even such a people and they should be unified under one political authority, speaking one language, sharing certain cultural practices, and so on and so forth, right? And finally, let's think about another aspect of language, right, which is policing the boundaries, right, of not just language, but also cultural praxis. Why is it important that people all speak the same language and eat the same food and wear the same clothes, that they be members of the same identity, right? People don't like it when someone who is not a member of their identity group puts on their clothes or wears their hairstyles, or listens to their music. Or people tend to be a little bit better about people eating their food. But what's this whole business of us thinking that there's us, our stuff, and their stuff, right? When we police those boundaries between us, right, that's what gives these identities meaning, is the fact that we think there's a boundary between what we as a people enjoy and do and eat and wear and so on and so forth, and what someone else does, right? And so by sticking within our comfort zone and excluding those who are not part of us from participating in our cultural practices, right, we give those identities meaning. Any questions or comments? All right, so at least do the Anderson reading for today, and you should be good with that for your paper in a couple of weeks. All right, so we'll call it a class unless there's any last questions.
Would you upload